And a very warm welcome. You're joining us at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24. The 78th budget was presented this week, and we're talking about how and what the implementation, how these budget proposals will be implemented, and what this means to the average common man, the corporates, the professionals, and overall growth of Sri Lanka. To discuss all this, to make sense of the budget proposals, we've invited to our studios a former director of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Dr. Roshan Perera. A very warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much for having me on this program.
Dr. Roshan, I think at the onset, let me just recap some of the estimates of the budget. 2024 total estimated expenditure is at 6.97 trillion rupees, and the estimated revenue for year 2024 is 4.17 trillion, or rather 4.12. The budget deficit an ambitious 9.1% of GDP, which is around 2.85 trillion rupees. And through the debt restructuring, Sri Lanka plans to bring debt to GDP down to 128% to 95%. That is from 128% to 95%, and gross financing need from 34.6% to 13%, and lower foreign debt financials from the current 9.4% to 4.5%. Ambitious targets here, Dr. Roshan, considering what we've gone through, considering that we have been talking about the need for policies that really stimulates the economy. Before I ask you what this budget is exactly, do you think Sri Lanka, our administrative structure, our economy has the necessary policies and structural framework in place now to meet these challenges and the targets that we have set through 2024 budget?
So let me start actually from where we were maybe a year ago. So if you look at the indicators, or the macroeconomic indicators a year ago, you'd know that we were basically the economy was contracting. Inflation was at the highest level. We reached something like 70% inflation rate. Reserves were down to, I think the budget speech itself said that reserves were down to about $20 million US. That was at the time that we went for a debt default, or we stopped paying our external debt service payments. And the budget deficit had really blown out. It was over 10% at the end of last year. So given the context in which we were in last year, I think you have to look at it in that overall context. Mm-hmm. So from there, we know what happened. We went into we took a lot of stabilization measures. We corrected some of the fuel pricing. We had very tight restrictions or tight monetary policy. So the interest rates were raised quite rapidly to rein in inflation. We had import controls put in because to stem the bleeding of our foreign reserves and our foreign exchange. So there were lots, plus there were some taxes removed, the fuel pricing adjustments. And then, of course, we started negotiating with the IMF on a program. And we finally agreed in a program in March. So I think you have to look at it in that context and where we are now. Mm-hmm. Since then, if you look at today, some of those macroeconomic variables have improved. So we know that inflation is now less than 2%. The reserves have, we have been able to build up some level of reserves. It's not adequate, but so I think we have to look at the budget in 2024 in the light of where we were and how far we have come. Of course, we have further to go, and maybe we can discuss that in the rest of the program.
But do you think these targets are a little too ambitious again than we can achieve, or do you think we do have the structural framework, the macroeconomic fundamentals to set the economy on a growth path that we envisage through this budget?
Yes, so I think if you look at the assumptions on which this budget has been developed, I think they are expecting, this year we're going to have a contraction in the economy, probably around 3% of GDP. I mean 3% contraction, and inflation, of course, as I said before, it's less than 2%. So next year's budget estimates basically have been built on a very conservative estimate of growth. It's less than 2%. And inflation, because now the central bank bill, the act has been passed, and there is a contract between the central bank and the Ministry of the government to basically maintain inflation at a mid-single digit level. So I think the budget forecast or the budget estimates, they've assumed something like 7 to 8% of inflation. So I think those are manageable. But the question is, given rather not a very robust growth in the economy, whether some of these targets can be met, and I agree with you, that is going to be very challenging, and maybe we can go through some of those estimates.
Right. You mentioned about the growth target for 2024 and estimates for this year. There will be a contraction of the economy, but the president in his speech said that the economic growth for the country would be, the target would be set at 1.8%, which is higher than IMF or World Bank estimates. Is this achievable?
So it's kind of within the targets, ballpark targets set by the IMF, World Bank and ADB. They're roughly within the same ballpark. But yes, it is going to be challenging because we are starting on a base which is basically contracting economy. So it's going to be a huge effort to raise growth. And given that we've had we're continuing, if you look at the fiscal policy, and we can talk about that later, we are still having like a stabilization budget, right? So we're kind of contracting. The fiscal policy is going to be contractionary. Monetary policy, fortunately now, because inflation is under control, they are able to give some kind of stimulus, maybe because interest rates have come down. So they are able to, that benefit can be passed on to the rest of the economy. But I think growth is critical. But to have that kind of growth, I think the implementation of many of the proposals that were stated in the budget are critical, because without those, improving productivity, undertaking some of the structural reforms to unleash, the potential in the economy, I think it will be very challenging to achieve even 1.8%. But I would go further and say that if we want to achieve some of the targets, particularly the revenue targets, the estimates that have been set out in this budget, I think we need to grow at even a higher rate than that.
From a state of a critical economy, we've achieved at a state where we need some critical reforms, which again is a relief that we're moving forward. But let me now talk a little about your perception, your view of the budget. There is objection from the opposition that this budget doesn't really look at providing relief for the masses, and on the other end there are questions whether government was honest about the revenue generation mechanisms, where the revenue is coming from, because the president's budget speech highlighted where the expenditure will be, where state sector employees will be getting their raise, and there were other expenditure categories that were discussed, but where the revenue will be generated. That's something we can talk about later. But what really is your view here about the overall formulation of this budget?
Yeah, so as I said at the beginning, I think we are continuing with kind of a stabilization program. So if you look at generally the objectives of fiscal policy, it's macroeconomic stabilization and fiscal, in our context, fiscal stabilization is, or sustainability is an important component, because Sri Lanka has basically been living beyond their our means. We have had, budget deficits almost from the beginning of, from our post-independence history, which has basically brought us to where we are, because we have had to borrow and we have had huge increases in debt. So I think that macro stabilization is the most important objective of this current budget. But of course, a budget or a fiscal policy should also allocate resources to foster more inclusive and sustainable growth, and also, as you said, distribute resources in an equitable manner. But I think if you look at this budget, I think the focus has been to continue with this macro stabilization, because we are in this IMF program, and under the IMF program, there are very strict targets in terms of what we have to achieve on the fiscal. So reining in the fiscal, making it more sustainable. We have a primary deficit, primary balance. We have to achieve a primary balance next year, and then of 0.8% or just under 1%, and then of course it has to improve even further to I think 2.5% over the medium term. Those are very challenging targets. So in order to do that, we have to make sure that we stick to this program and ensure that we achieve this kind of sustainability, these targets. But going on to talk about what you mentioned about the revenue target. So basically, to achieve this primary surplus, we have to generate sufficient revenue because we have not a lot of leeway on the expenditure side. There's limited leeway. So revenue generation is critical, and even in the IMF program, I think it's termed a revenue-based fiscal consolidation or centered fiscal consolidation. So if you look at the revenue targets, basically it's very quite ambitious. They expect, because this year, as you know from the first review of the IMF program, it was found that basically we are going to even fall short of the revenue collection in 2023. And that was one reason why they delayed the release of the second tranche of the IMF, the EFF. So even this year we're going to fall short of our revenue targets. And this is after we put in quite a lot of new revenue measures, right? Just you remember the income taxes, the various other taxes that were revised in order to bring in additional revenue. So this, and I think the increase in revenue that we expected last year was something, it was close to 50%, 48%, or we increased revenue by about 48%. This year the increase on top of that is another 47%. So that is quite challenging, and I think...
So where do you think, Dr. Roshan, this money is going to come into the state coffers? That's one question that many have. Who is going to be taxed next? Is it the same set of professionals to the middle income earners who will be further burdened with taxes, or is the government looking at a tier that is a little higher than that?
Yeah, so if you look at the breakdown of how these taxes will be collected, the bulk that they're assuming is that it's going to be collected through taxes on domestic goods and services. So basically it's consumption, domestic consumption, which is translated to basically the VAT. And we've already seen they've increased the VAT rate, or the proposed VAT, the rate is going to be increased from January 2024
by 3%.
From 15% to 18%, exactly. So that's part of it. Of course, there are some other policy, tax policy changes that they propose, like on the threshold, on the exemptions, etc. And so the bulk of the revenue, I think about 60% or so, is going to come from the goods that, from taxing the consumption, domestic consumption. The rest is, of course, they're expecting from external trade, because now they removed some of the, most of the restrictions on imports. I think only motor vehicles are still under, these restrictions. So they're expecting growth on that front, and some of it, of course, from the corporate taxes. So that is going to be challenging, because when you increase taxes on consumption, while you expect, the economic growth to generate more, people spending more, if the prices go up, obviously, you have an impact on
curtailing
demand.
Economic activity, and then there is, yes.
So your demand also might fall, because as prices go up, obviously demand falls. So it's going to be very challenging to see how these different, things pan out over the course of the year. So I think, again, what I have to emphasize is growth, growth, growth. We have to go for growth to be able to realize some of these numbers, because otherwise it's going to be very challenging to, at the end of the year, to actually meet those targets that we have to.
You emphasize on growth. I'd like to ask what fundamentals we need to have in place to ensure that these growth targets are achieved. We've been talking about the state-owned enterprises, the public sector, which is a massive burden on the government, and questions of its efficiency have been continuously spoken of. At the same time, the President himself during the budget speech, while announcing an increment of cost of living allowances to the state sector, the President himself mentioned that without improving the efficiency of state-owned enterprises, we cannot be demanding much from the government. With all that, how do you think all these segments, sectors, stakeholders of government, the economy should be put together to achieve this growth that you talk about is mandatory for us to achieve our medium to long-term expectations?
So that's a really good question, because as I've kept saying, we have to kind of rein in government, reduce actually the burden of the government or the fiscal on the rest of the economy. Because what has happened so far all this time is, as soon as we have these revenue shortfalls, and we've had revenue shortfalls, I mean, if you look at the estimates for revenue over the last so many years, we have always had a shortfall. But we don't do much adjustment on the expenditure front, because I said there's not a lot of leeway there, because interest payments, they're contractual obligations, you have to pay them. Salaries and wages are contractual, pensions. So there's not a lot of leeway on the expenditure side. So where does the burden fall? You basically have to borrow. Either you have to borrow domestically, or you have to borrow from foreign sources. When we borrow domestically, either we have to borrow from the banking sector or from non-bank sector, which is the EPF and the insurance funds, etc. Now, what we have seen in the last few years basically is that as the government's deficit has been increasing, they are borrowing from the banking sector, and I'm not talking only government, actually it's a public sector, because you talked about the state-owned enterprises. Their borrowing from the banking sector has been increasing. And as a result, the amount of funds that has been available for the private sector has been diminishing. So that has had that is obviously one impact, that has had an impact on growth. Because we keep saying the private sector is the engine of growth. But if the government and the state sector is absorbing a lot of the resources from the economy, the private sector is constrained. So that is one reason why we need to reduce the size of the government, reduce the impact of these state-owned enterprises on the rest of the economy, and allow the private sector to grow, because ultimately the private sector is going to have to generate that growth, because as we said, governments are not meant to be running enterprises, doing business really. They should be setting the framework for business, but not really running business.
And I suppose that's why state sector employees are also not too keen on improving efficiency, because they're not meant to be in business. But then again, Dr. Roshan, you mentioned this, it comes to mind when you say private sector, the engine of growth of any economy. In Sri Lanka specifically, this private sector drove growth during the most difficult period, whether it's COVID, whether it's the economic crisis, whether it's the post-Easter Sunday attacks, challenges that Sri Lanka faced. And on top of that, professionals have been taxed, and most of the burden on professionals again to pay taxes. With that, what kind of support should government also look at giving the private sector in order to facilitate that growth and to help the private sector spur economic growth through increased activity?
So I'll go back to this thing of, I'll just give you some statistics actually of how much, so what where the government started eating up resources from the rest of the economy, we call it a crowding out, right, of the private, crowding out of resources basically, particularly I'm talking about the banking sector. So in the 1990s, if you look at how much of the, the resources or the lending from the banking sector went to government, and the proportion, about 20% went to government, now about 80% went to private sector. As you come to the 2000s, it's become 50-50. In fact, if I looked at August, I looked at the data for August, government has been absorbing about 57% of the resources from the banking sector, and the private sector 43%. So it has switched. So we need to switch it back. So the government has to start reducing its burden on the or how much it takes out from that, and release these resources for the private sector so that it can grow. But you talked about taxes and the professionals having to pay more taxes, and I know there's a lot of and even corporates and things like that. But if you look at in terms of the overall economy, our payment of taxes is very low. If you compare it with any country in the region, we are paying 7-8% of GDP. Other countries are much higher. Even in our region, it's like 15%. Is a developing country, and there is a threshold. If you go below that, you are going to get into this kind of trouble. So we have to push up our tax to GDP ratio. So I think but my point is, the point I want to make is, sometimes you're kind of the burden is on the people who are paying taxes even now. So the existing taxpayers. I think we have to look beyond, because we have a huge, there are lots of individuals, corporates who are outside the tax net. We have huge, cash economy. We need to address that and bring those into the tax net. And I think the budget talks about some of these things. So basically, insisting that when you open a bank account, if you go to register your motor vehicle or if you go to register your land, etc., that you have to go with your TIN number, which is your taxpayer identification number. It's therefore insisting that everybody opens a tax file. To get that, you have to open a tax file. So that would be one way in getting people who are outside the tax net into the tax net. So I think those are some things that need to be done. The second one, basically for individuals, because there are so many people operating just in a cash economy. On the corporate side, we have a huge number of firms which are outside the tax net because of the these very generous tax incentives that have been given over so many years under different regimes. We have had the BOI, we have the Inland Revenue, we have the Strategic Development Projects Act, and they have tax holidays for 20, 30, 40 years. Now we cannot have that. I mean, if we are willing to restructure debt, that is a contractual obligation. If we are willing to go that far because of the situation we are in now, I think we need to even consider renegotiating some of these tax incentives that we have given, and at least get everyone to pay some kind of minimum tax. And there is a minimum tax in the world. Now, we are not a signatory yet of this global minimum tax. I think we need to bring in some of these measures.
You mentioned tax exemptions that we've been granting to our investors over these years. But renegotiating these taxes or exemptions that we've granted, what kind of challenges will Sri Lanka achieve? But has this been done elsewhere in other countries in similar situations? Because that's definitely going to bring us back most of our foreign reserves as well.
So I don't think there are many countries that have gone through this kind of crisis, and also have given such generous tax incentives. They are probably one of the few countries. So obviously, this might be a test case. But if we are able to have these negotiations with our creditors, and we have signed agreements with them, but we are negotiating because they understand that they might never get this money back. No? So they have to have some kind of agreement that over time we will pay this money back. So it's same with these corporates or the other investors. If they are going to thrive in this country, and if they are going to see some kind of growth, we might need to have to come to some compromise. But yes, this might be a test case. Sorry.
While talking about taxes as well, Dr. Roshan, about the kind of the benefits that you give back to your taxpayers. Yes, we have to expand our tax net, bring more into the tax net, and then target those who have been evading taxation for so long. But at the same time, for those who are paying taxes, do you see that this budget at least sets the path towards giving back through to the general public in terms of infrastructure, improved facilities, whether it's healthcare, transport? How does that? How have we addressed that?
So I would say that I think the biggest tax on the whole population actually we faced through inflation. That was the highest tax actually. Now we're trying to address that monetary policy has tried to address it, but also fiscal policy has to. So I think that is the benefit that we're giving the public, and I think the public needs to understand that it's not the handouts. The handouts come and go. I mean, but even what you give as handouts, even the salary increments, the Samuddi or Swasuma payments, all that will basically, the real value of that will be lost if inflation starts increasing again. So I think we have to understand that and understand that this is what the budget is trying to do, and what monetary policy and fiscal policy both are trying to do, is to keep the macro stabilization, the macro indicators in a stable way, so that maybe in a year or two we can start seeing some kind of growth, and then be able to do the other things that we need to do, that we have put on hold really.
Before we go in for a short break, I'd also like to touch on domestic debt restructuring situation before we talk about also banks and recapitalization that the budget talks about. But how, in your view, is this process going forward?
So I think the domestic debt restructuring is basically gone through. The external debt restructuring has taken longer than expected, but you can't say expected as well, because in other countries it has taken time. But we really need to fast track this, and this is where I think the international organizations also need to kind of push to try and fast track this process, because otherwise it's up to the individual country to push it through. But if you don't do this, the entire debt restructuring, it's going to have an impact, because basically your interest is racking up, and it has an impact. Even you can't even have, investors are not willing to come in until they see this finalized. So I think this is something that really needs to be pushed through next year as early as possible.
Right. I think we'll take a short break now here at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24. We are in conversation with former director of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Dr. Roshan Perera. We'll return after this short break. To stay with us. Welcome back. You're joining us once again at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24 as we try to make sense of the 2024 budget, where the revenue is coming into the government, how the expenses are going to be planned out, how SOE reforms will take shape, and what really Sri Lanka's growth prospects are going forward. Dr. Roshan, you were talking about the domestic debt restructuring, external debt restructuring progress, and how international organizations could help Sri Lanka fast track this. But within Sri Lanka, let's talk a little about the state banks that you spoke about, how the president himself spoke about the burden on state banks after years of state-owned enterprises depending on these banks. But why do we really need to recapitalize state-owned banks in the country?
So I think this is tied in with this whole state-owned enterprise reform, because we know for many years the losses that the state-owned enterprises have been racking up, particularly on the big ones like the CEB, the CPC, the Sri Lankan Airlines. The losses have really been parked in these banks. So as a result, these banks, their balance sheets are basically constrained, or they are not able to lend for other activities, because they don't have enough. Their capital has been constrained by the losses that of the SAVs have been parked in their books. So basically what they're trying to do is to release these banks from these loans. So that bank recapitalization is really basically where the government takes over or pays off those debts, or the debts of the SOEs, cleans up the balance sheets of the state banks, and then basically they are kind of they release them really to do the banking activity for the rest of the economy. And this is what I said, because they have basically been crowded, there has been a crowding out of resources, right, which I spoke about earlier. So I think that is the whole purpose of this bank recapitalization. But once it is recapitalized, we can't go to business as usual in the state banks. They have to be managed and they have to be run in a way that is beneficial to the rest of the economy. So they can't be again, this financing source for the government and the state banks, the state-owned enterprises. They have to lend according to some kind of, the model, the criteria on which other banks also, the private sector banks have certain, objectives and criteria on which they lend. So I think the same kind of governance structure needs to come into these state banks, and I think that is where this whole thing of divesting some of the shares of the state banks come in. And once they go public or once they're listed, they have much more, stringent requirements. Of course, now they are still regulated by the central bank, so they do come under, a framework which is applicable to all banks. But I think the governance structures and governance framework has to be strengthened so that they operate on par with any other private bank.
And also have criteria in terms of how and whose loans you write off, why you write off those loans. But at the same time, you spoke about these state banks and state enterprises, how the recapitalization process happens. But don't you think this will also add another burden on the taxpayers if government is going to clear these balance sheets and move forward?
So I think maybe people didn't understand this, but if you read the IMF staff report, which was put out in March 2023, there was an allocation of, I think, 6% of GDP for bank recapitalization. And I think that's going to come from the multilateral agencies. So it will probably come with very concessional financing over a longer period. So even though it looks like the budget deficit is going to increase because of that, but I think the modalities of how this is going to be financed will be very different to the financing of the rest of the budget.
And how will this also, the recapitalization process, support state-owned enterprises? We're looking at repurposing, restructuring, unbundling them. So if you can just take us through that as well.
Yes, so now if you look at the state-owned enterprises and you look at their balance sheet, I mean, there's nobody who's going to even look at them, right? Because they have such huge losses and their debts have racked up to such a high level. And also if you look at, even if they are on making operating profits, which some of them are, but not all, their financial losses, the financial costs are so high because they have these huge obligations to the banks, to foreign, where they have borrowed abroad. Their final, bottom line is negative, right? That they're making huge losses. So if you clean up their debts, at least they can start from, hopefully making operating profits and overall profits, but also to make it more transparent. Because now what happens is they may be showing profits in 1 year, losses in 1 year, but actually the entire burden of that is not reflected in the government's budget because it's hidden somewhere in the state bank balance sheets. Here what they're saying is, if you are, say you have to give some, have to give a concessionary rate for some utility or transport, we were talking about transport, then whatever the losses they make there has to be reflected in the government's budget. It can't be hidden away in some, bank balance sheet. You have to be upfront. If you're giving a certain, and we call this public service obligations, there are certain things that the government has to provide, maybe. Say transport in very remote areas, you might have to provide it at below cost. But then you have to cost that, and that cost has to be reflected directly in the budget so that everybody is aware, okay, this is a subsidy or concession that's given, but this is the cost of it. So I think that's another reason why it is important to clear these balance sheets and then start from that point where it's more transparent that the costs are because of these subsidies, not because of inefficiencies and other things, but it's because of the direct subsidy or concession that the government wants to give.
Government has decided to increase borrowing by 3.4 trillion rupees to 7.3 for the next year. That is during 2024. While this debt restructuring process happens, how do you think Sri Lanka should really look at managing this kind of debt?
So I just want to read to you a statement or from a document, a previous document. It could very well have been what was read out in the budget 2 days or 3 days ago. But this is another document. So it says, the truth is that Sri Lanka is in the throes of an economic crisis, a crisis born of deep indebtedness, and if not arrested soon, it will keep employment and incomes in the worst nadir for generations to come, right? And what they're saying is and the reason is government debt has expanded dramatically to the point where today the size of public debt is larger than the country's GDP. And how do they calculate it? They basically say that each man, woman and child, so the total public debt translates to something like 7,500 for every man, woman and child. Okay? So each person has to pay. And then they say, if eventually, if we don't address this, we or our children will have to face the prospect of being unable to repay this debt. However, long before that, the country's reputation will be at stake because it's a country that can't manage its resources and maintain its creditworthiness, and it will be damaged to the point where we will be unable to recover. Okay, so where do you think or when do you think this statement was made? And then it says, of course, our single-minded priority should be to overcome this debt crisis. That's all in this one document. Now, would you try to hazard guess of when this document was actually written, when these statements were written? It was from the Regaining Sri Lanka document, which was put out by the government in December 2002.
December 2002.
Right? We are now in a worse situation because if you look at how much each man, woman and child owes in terms of debt, is something like 1.2 million.
10 years after that document, we were in crisis, and now
20 years. This
20 years
ago.
2002, yes, not 12 years. 20 years on,
yeah.
We were in the deepest crisis that the economy saw, and any economy in the world would have seen in this an unprecedented situation. This crisis also gave rise to questions and and made us understand that we had many governance issues that needs to be addressed. How do you think the approach is of the current government, or even through these policy measures that have been taken, to really rectify the questions of governance mismatches that we've been talking about, and that these development agencies, international lending agencies, have continuously highlighted, especially asking or demanding Sri Lanka to rectify?
So I think a really good study that was done recently by the IMF was this governance diagnostic study, where they released this report, and it covers, I think, 6 different areas, but I will focus on the fiscal since we're talking about the budget, and it has very specific recommendations on how to improve revenue efficiency, how to improve expenditure efficiency, and also budget transparency. So it's all there. What we need to do is all there. The issue, and the laws that we have to pass, the kind of better structures that we have to have, the reporting that we have to make, it's all there. I think it's in implementation. We have to make sure we can pass the laws, we can do all everything that tick the box. But finally, the crux is in how well we implement, how well we enforce those. Because I'll just give you an example. We passed the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act in 2003. Under that act, we should have maintained the budget deficit at 5%. I think from 2006 or something, so they gave them a little bit of time to bring the budget deficit to 2.6%. To date, we have never achieved that, bring it down to 5%. To date, we have never achieved that. We have consistently violated, and this is a legal requirement, we have consistently violated that. The same with debt. They said we had to bring down debt to 80%, I can't exactly remember by when. But every time we came close to the target, we basically moved it to another date. We said, okay. And now we have moved it to 2030. So we're supposed to bring it down to. So there's no point in having laws unless they're enforced. So that's my take. I mean, you can have the laws or put in the frameworks, but There has to be enforcement and implementation.
That's a great point, but I'd like to speak further on that. We are in the final segment. We have about 8 minutes left, but I want to focus a little on elimination of non-tariff barriers, non-tariff import taxes actually, and including import cess, port and airport levy. How would this benefit the government if there's no purchasing power inside the country? We spoke about curtailing economic activity with taxes on consumption. VAT again increased to 18% by 3% from the present 15%. If that happens, and if we're looking at targeted income, without that, you spoke about this as a challenge, but how are we really looking at creating that kind of revenue?
So yes, there's two things there. I mean, I think we have to see, the costs and benefits of these para tariffs. The benefit is okay. We earn some revenue from it, but I think the costs are much higher because the cost of these para tariffs is basically they prevent your trade. It is a barrier to trade. And as we've been saying, I think at the beginning, growth is really important, and our source of growth really has to come from exports, because as we said, the domestic economy is still, there are a lot of challenges from in terms of the increasing domestic demand or stimulating from within. But so we have to, tap outside markets or external markets. The only way to do that is basically by freeing trade or allowing trade to happen. And one of the barriers of trade has been these para tariffs. So I think that's a good step. But the thing is that we have said this in many budgets before, but I think again it's a point of implementation. Because if you look at our trade openness as a country, we are at a level that we were in something like the 1960s and 70s, where we really were closed. We were considered a closed economy actually. So we really need to expand our trade because we are a small economy with only 22 million population. We have to tap markets outside of us. And it's going to be very challenging the next year, because if you look at the global forecasts for trade or the economic forecasts, our traditional markets are not going to be growing that fast next year. That's a projection from the IMF in their World Economic Outlook. But if you look at emerging Asia and developing Asia, the prospects are much better. So we really need to move, our trade towards those areas. And I think the government, the budget actually had some proposals in terms of, getting RCEP and getting into, some kind of FTAs with some of our regional partners. But again, it's implementation, because we talk about these, but how quickly can we actually get into those? And even once we get into those FTAs, utilization rates have been very low. I mean, there has to be some process to facilitate or to, enable the businesses to actually utilize this. So it's a long process. I think those are the challenges that we will face.
Whether it's whether we're on a path to recovery or a path to stability right now, how do we really convince foreign investors to come invest in Sri Lanka? Do we have those question on governance, addressing corruption and other ease of doing business concerns addressed, especially after the crisis now in Sri Lanka?
So I think again we have to have single-minded focus on what is our objective, where do we want to go, and then look at the lower hanging fruit. What can be done quickly? Start doing some of those things, because we keep talking about the reforms, the structural reforms, the productivity improvements that we need, and it's all very nice on paper, but actually what are we doing? So if you look at say the land reforms, they talk about BIM Savia, but how quickly can that be implemented? Who is going to put that in place? Because if you don't do those unlocking land, investors are not going to be able to come, because now they find it very difficult to access land. The labor reforms, we have been talking about the whole of last year, we talked about labor, or this year, sorry. But still we have to see concrete evidence of these labor reforms. So I think we have to start doing them. Otherwise, investors are, they're not going to believe us.
Very quickly, what about the central bank now? We saw the Central Bank Act and we're talking about the central bank's autonomy, but in terms of its strength, how do you assess that now?
So I think they have, the Act basically gives them quite a lot of, operational autonomy, which I think is very important, particularly in terms of, the problems that have had in the past of having to finance the deficit, which really puts them out of whack in terms of their own objectives of keeping inflation. But I think also where they have these conflicts of interest, particularly on the debt management. So I think there has been stated that this debt management office is going to be set up, because then you're going to separate that, right? Because that is a conflict of interest. And even the other areas which are not central bank functions, like the EPF management or the EPF. I think all those things need to be addressed one by one, so that the central bank can focus on its main objectives, which is price stability, but also the financial stability part.
And finally, I'd like to ask you, as we said, we're going to make sense of budget 2024. How is this macro program going to span out, and what will it really mean for the people 2024? We understand it's going to be tough. There's a lot of sacrifices that the people made and will make because of wrong policies of policymakers. But what will this 2024 again mean, so that we know what to look forward to?
Yes, so I think you've said it. It's not going to be easy the next year, but I think we all need to understand that the path is, from where we were, because we went into the worst crisis in our history. It's going to take a few years for us to get out of it. I think we need to understand that and ensure that we stay on this program, on this path, but also to hold the government accountable to this, and to not abdicate our responsibility as citizens. To ensure that the government actually acts because this is in the interest of all of us, to make sure that we achieve some, at least this program, or stick to this fiscal program, because if we deviate from that, due to we get sidetracked by other interests or other things, it will take us a long time to get back on track.
Thank you very much for sharing your expertise and thoughts here at Hyde Park.
Thank you very much.
We had with us Dr. Roshan Perera, who is an expert in regulating and supervising financial institutions to help strengthen their approaches to managing risks, former director of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, a senior research personality at Advocata Institute since year 2020. We were trying to make sense of budget 2024, what it really means to the people, and how these revenue generating mechanisms will impact the ordinary citizen. We'll return with yet another discussion at Hyde Park next week at the same time. Thank you for watching. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.